Well, welcome to the BreakPoint Podcast. Always fun to have my friend Rod Dreher to talk about whatever latest thing that he has written. And Rod, I don't want to take too much credit, but I'm pretty sure I have done more than anybody else to promote a 2013 article you wrote called Sex After Christianity. I always tell people to Google it, but Google it carefully. And of course, we spent a lot of time at the Colson Center engaging the Benedict option on various levels. Just really appreciated that. Your latest book has got a wonderful title. And I've got to say, I have been going back to Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Harvard speech almost multiple times a day since 2016. And so the title of this book, coming from Solzhenitsyn, obviously grabbed my attention. The book, again, Live Not By Lies, a manual for Christian dissidents. Rod, it's good to see you. Thank you. Yes, here it is. We both have it. Great to see you. And thanks for joining us again on the BreakPoint Podcast.
It's great to be here. And I'm always glad to be in the trenches with you, John.
Well, we are. And I just want to say that I'm honored that you would come on here after going on Tucker Carlson. So there's a great connection. That says a lot. So I'm grateful for that. Look, we're joking and having fun because you are one of those guys I feel like always brings interest in life to a room. The book, however, just like the Benedict option, is a quite serious book. And what I was struck by in Live Not By Lies is, I've always appreciated your ability to write and to communicate, but the real strength of this is not your ideas. The real strength of this is the dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of stories from people who survived very hard times under communist regimes in another time in another place. Talk a little bit, first of all, about that process. I mean, just spending so much time with these individuals. I want to get into the why and the how it relates to today, but that was a remarkable part of this book, was just story after story after story.
Yeah, the second half of the book is what I found, or a distillation of what I found traveling through the former Soviet bloc, and it's some of the countries of Eastern Europe as well as Russia, talking to Christians, Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox, who had suffered, many of them in prison, some of them even tortured for their faith, just trying to find out, how did you do it? And what can we Christians in America today learn from what you went through? And I got to tell you, man, it is so humbling to realize how much we've been given in this country. We've never really had to suffer anything for our faith, African-American Christians being the obvious exception, but most of us have never had to worry about being hauled away to the gulag for our faith. I can remember in particular sitting in a hotel room in Moscow at the Hotel Metropole, talking to a man named Alexander Ogorodnikov, who's in the book. He was a Christian convert in the early 70s, had been raised in a very prominent communist family. So when they hauled him off to prison, they wanted to make an example of him. And this old man, he's like about 70 now, when he was talking to me, his face is partly paralyzed from the beatings he took in prison for Christ. And to hear him tell these stories, just of what he saw, what he heard, what he did, and even a couple of miraculous things had happened to him in prison. He was visited by an angel one night and repeatedly. And he's sitting there surrounded by luxury in the new Moscow in a hotel that had once, back in the day, been a KGB nest. In fact, it made him scared. The translator told me later he was kind of scared to come here because he knew what this place used to be. But there he sat amid all this luxury, and he's poor now, telling his testimony, and just the privilege of being there as an American and as a believer to hear this was one of the greatest gifts God's ever given me.
Well, I thought about that. I mean, there were so many stories. I remember that story specifically, and I remember in the book, you're meeting with family members at times of individuals that will go down in the annals of church history. I mean, we're just not kind of far enough from it to think about that. But, that to me was amazing. And I just am so grateful for the role that you're playing in telling their stories. At the same time, that is the point you're trying to make, is that there's something that we need to learn from these victims of what you call hard totalitarianism, because we're headed into what you call a soft totalitarianism. Now, people are going to question, look, Rod, you know, your hair's on fire. You're pushing
Wait,
too hard. This is,
yeah,
you do have great hair, by the way, and I cannot claim anything near the same thing.
I
I'm
thought you were
jealous.
making fun of me.
I'm jealous. But first of all, talk about, you know, just the argument there that that we are headed into a time of soft totalitarianism. And what is the relationship to hard totalitarianism? How do you define that?
Well, you know, when I first heard this argument, I was skeptical too. It came to me in 2015 when there was this big blow up. You will recall, and many of your listeners will, over the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in the state of Indiana. This was back in 2015, just before Obergefell. And the state of Indiana tried to pass a RFRA, state version of the RFRA, to protect Christians and other religious people, and they got sued for discrimination. When that happened, there was this explosion of anger from corporations, major corporations, that threatened the state with all kinds of economic punishments if they didn't get rid of this bigoted law. There was even a blow up against this little evangelical pizza parlor owned by evangelicals, Memories Pizza, who said to a TV reporter that they wouldn't cater a gay wedding. Suddenly there was this national, it was a fire. People literally threatened to burn down their business. Well, I got a phone call after all that happened from a doctor, a physician in Minnesota, who said, look, you don't know me, but I need to tell somebody this. My mother is elderly, lives with me and my wife. She spent 4 years of her life when she was young in a prison camp in Czechoslovakia, her native homeland, because she was a Christian. And now she's saying, son, the things I'm seeing happen in America now remind me of what happened when communism came. And this was in part sparked by this attack on Christians in Indiana. Well, I thought that was really alarmist, John. And but I took it under advisement. I contacted a couple I knew who had defected in the 1960s from Hungary, asked them, is this Czech woman onto something, or is she kind of crazy? They said, oh, no, it's happening. We see it every day. Every time we turn on the TV or read the paper, there's something new happening that makes us think that this is like what we grew up with. Well, what is it? As I talk, John, over and over again to people who live in this country and in the UK about what they're seeing that reminds them of communism, it's the same thing over and over again. The idea that there is one ideology that you have to bow down to in order to get ahead in this society and to avoid trouble. You can, if you don't say yes to it, you can lose your job, you can lose your status, you can lose friends, and that this is more and more developing the force of law. We call it wokeness, we call it cancel culture, we call the people who practice it social justice warriors. But these people are the vanguard, according to people who grew up under communism, the vanguard of some totalitarianism. Now, it's not going to be hard totalitarianism, at least not at first. It's not going to be the KGB coming to knock down your door and to haul you off and torture you. That's our idea of what happened in the Soviet Union. I mean, it did happen there. It's what happened in Nazi Germany, and it's what happened in George Orwell's 1984. Rather, this is going to be something softer. It's going to come on us as sort of a therapeutic totalitarianism, totalitarianism that says you must not say these things because you're going to hurt somebody's feelings. And eventually, you will lose your job for hurting somebody's feelings. And it's coming to us, we're accepting it through consumer capitalism. In other words, from everything we do on our smartphones, the things we shop for online, all of this is tracked by major corporations. It sounds paranoid. It's actually not paranoid. They do this openly, and they do this legally, but they're gathering more and more information on us that I fully believe within my lifetime, maybe in the next 10 years, will be part of a social credit system like they have in communist China, where they control people, not by threatening to put them in prison, though they do have that there, but rather by monitoring and governing their access to consumer comforts, to jobs, and to different privileges. They don't have to send the secret police to you if you can't get a good job or your kids can't go to college because you go to church, and they know they do because they tracked your phone there. That's the sort of thing that I think we're running into right here, and we will soon have it if we don't find some way to stop it.
Is there a way to stop it? I mean, look, that's a dark, dreadful scenario, and at the same time, I mean, the obvious point is look, when it comes to the tech invasion, at least this tool that will be used in this scenario to bring about this sort of totalitarian pressure. I mean, that cat's out of the bag. I mean, what about us isn't already, being captured, by big corporations to frame, what they're selling us? Is there a going back on that?
No, I don't think there is. I mean, all we can do is withdraw as much as we can. When I was in Prague talking to this woman, Camilla Bendova, she raised 6 kids under communism. They're all a Catholic family, and all of those kids are still practicing Catholics, as are the grandchildren, this in the most atheist country in Europe. Anyway, Camilla, sitting in her apartment talking to her, I noticed she didn't have a smartphone. She had a dumb phone. I asked her about that. She said that nobody in my family will have a smartphone. I'm like, why is that? She said, if you've lived through what we lived through with our house being surveilled, their house was bugged, everything was bugged. She said, you would know that nobody collects this private information about you for innocent purposes. She said, I don't understand why young people today, and Westerners in particular, are so naive about this, thinking that, well, I don't do anything bad. This information is not going to hurt me. She said, they'll always find a way to use it against you. Now, I don't think there's any going back on that. The best we can do is lessen our exposure to it, but I don't think we can fully escape it. I think also, John, that there's we make a real mistake as Christians to think that if we only vote for the right people and get the right people on the courts, then all this will go away. It is important to vote. It is important to have good judges. Don't get me wrong there. But this ideology is based in something that most Americans take for granted, expressive individualism. That is the idea that I can make my own reality, and anything that tells me that I must do something that I don't want to do is somehow wrong and illegitimate. I think that we're going to be we're going to see a totalitarianism come into being based on this idea that anybody who says thou shalt not is going to have to go to prison or suffer in some way because tolerance.
Right. Yeah. Well, you've used another phrase called, and this kept occurring to me as I was reading the book, and I was thinking about some story yesterday that we addressed. In fact, I'll share it with you. It's probably the 3rd or 4th time we've gotten this question. We do a segment on the BreakPoint podcast called Ask BreakPoint, just based on something we've said or written. And, it was a public school teacher, actually from the town where I live, saying, hey, look, I was just told we need to use preferred pronouns. I think it's wrong. What are my options? And, what resources can you send? I said, well, the best resource I can send is prayer, because I don't think, there's not an easy way out of this one. But you've used this idea called the law of merited possibility, right? Which is, which seems to me to kind of fit in with this. The technological surveillance is a tool. What's driving this is kind of an ideology, right? And ideologies, like communism, use whatever tools they had. The tools of their time was something else. Do you see you could define you define it better than I do.
Yeah. The law of merited impossibility is it will never happen, and when it does, you bigots will deserve it.
Yeah, that just seems like it'll never happen that you'll lose your job for being, having Christian convictions. But when it happens, you guys, that seems to fit right into this scenario.
Yeah, it does. And what I would say to the school teacher is there is no easy way out. You will either compromise your conscience or you will find another job. And I remember talking, John, to this priest who was in Russia. His church is built right next to a place where the KGB, in a 14-month period in the 1930s, massacred 21,000 political prisoners. This priest, Father Kirill Kaleda, he's in the book, he pushed to have this be made a national monument to the victims of political violence, and as a church built next to it. Father Kirill said that we as Christians should not seek out suffering. But if it comes to us, if we have to answer the question, then we have to be prepared to make that sacrifice. Now, when people ask me, what should I do in this particular situation? I resist answering them because I don't know all the facts there. I mean, this person who asked you the question, she may have kids to support. It may be very hard for her to quit her job right now. But ultimately, she's going to have to answer the question because this is not going to be the first time they push. And I would suggest to Christians who listen to this to do whatever you can now to have plan B for your job when you will lose your job because of your faith. There are things we can do, jobs we can go to, fields we can go into where we won't be pushed this way, but those fields are going to be narrowing more and more. And I think that Christians maybe should even think of starting businesses to provide safe harbor for believers who just want to do their job, and who don't want to bend the knee and burn the pinch of incense to woke Caesar.
So I got to be honest. I want this book to be wrong, right? I want this to be an overstatement of comparing soft totalitarianism and hard totalitarianism, and I do think it could potentially be wrong, but you can certainly see it from here. You know what I mean? There's no question, and we have already seen enough of individuals, random kind of seemingly random individuals who have faced the sort of social and cultural pressure that are here. What I really love about this book, though, Rod, is that we can always learn from these individuals who had to deal with the cultural pressures that we are facing. And I'm not comparing it. I mean, we're not facing gulags. We're not facing the sort of tortures that are described by, Richard Wurmbrand and other people that you talk about in the book. But there are a couple key lessons, and I want to talk about a few of them. The first one is it Father Kolacovic? I'm not sure I'm saying that right. Kolacovic. And you summed up here, and maybe he summed up, which kind of his threefold approach to having to live with this sort of ideological pressure
and engage that culture.
See, judge, act. Walk us through each of those. That's a lesson for every Christian everywhere. Everyone. See, judge, act.
Father Tomislov Kolacovic is a man I dedicate the book to. I'm not a Catholic. He was a Catholic priest, but he sets an example for all of us Christians. In 1943, he was living in his native Croatia doing anti-Nazi work when he got a tip that the Gestapo was coming for him. He escaped to his mother's homeland, Slovakia, adopted her last name, Kolakovic, and started teaching at a Catholic university there. And he told his students, he said, listen, the good news is the Germans are going to lose this war. The bad news is this country is going to be ruled by communism. And the first thing they're going to do is come after Christians. So we got to get ready for it. He was told by his bishops, you're being alarmist, but he knew what was actually coming because he had studied the Soviet mindset. So what he did was organize cells of Christian believers, like prayer groups. They would come together for prayer and Bible study, but they would also study the society around them according to a program that he had picked up from a priest in Western Europe. There was a three-part process there: see, judge, and act. To see means to look around you at the culture and see what's really going on there. To judge means to submit it to what you all know to be true from Scripture and the teachings of the church, and argue about it to figure out what Christians are called to do in this moment, and then go out determined to act in the world to live out the gospel under these conditions. A simple process, but when each one of these little groups scattered around the country did that, John, they ended up building a network that became the basis for the underground church. Because sure enough, when communism, when the Iron Curtain fell, the first thing they did was go after the pastors and shut down the churches. But Father Kolakovic's circles of believers, armed with their knowledge of Scripture, armed with their faith, armed with their friendship with each other, and armed with see, judge, act, became witnesses.
I just thought, look, I have parents say, how do I keep my kids in the faith? And what a great line. See, judge, act, right? Mm-hmm. And that first point, see, is just see what's actually happening, not what you're told. I mean, what a remarkable, applicable thing in an age of information in which we have so much misinformation.
Yeah,
just
John,
the discipline. Yeah.
See what's there, not what you want to see. And this is one of the key lessons of the book. Alexander Solzhenitsyn warned in a preface to the Gulag Archipelago. He said the mistake everybody makes is to look at what happened in Russia and think it could never happen here. In fact, it could happen anywhere on earth. The great scholar Hannah Arendt, in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, She said, every time this sort of thing starts coming, when the signs of totalitarianism start to build, there's always inside every one of us a liberal who says, no, it's not really happening here. It really is happening here. We've got to open our eyes up and act based on reality, not on what we wish were happening.
Yeah. You tell a story as well, being at a dinner party and at a home. I'm trying to remember. It might be Hungary. I mean, there's so many stories that you move. Oh, yeah. And you basically say, how could anyone believe the Bolsheviks? And I think that's such a great question, because that's a form of it can never happen here.
Sure.
No one would ever really fall for that. And what a remarkable answer the father of that family gave you.
That's right. This was a Christian family. I was at their dinner table, and I'd been in Russia for several days by then. I heard lots of stories of suffering, torture, that sort of thing. And I couldn't imagine how anybody could have ever welcomed the Bolsheviks. And when I said that, the father looked at me and said, you want to know how this country got the Bolsheviks? And he went back 300 years to tell us stories of how the ruling authorities had always oppressed the poor. And church leaders had been part of that too, over and over and over, centuries of this. And by the time they got to the end of the 19th century, the late imperial period, they were sick of it. And even though the Bolsheviks were giving them what turned out to be lies and murderous lies, they were so weary, the poor, of having to put up with so much oppression, that they were willing to believe anything that set them free. In a similar way, in our society, we're not facing any sort of oppression like the Tsarist regime put on the Russian people, but it's also the case that so many young people today don't feel like they have a future. They look at the economy and they see it's not working for them. They wonder if they'll ever be able to start a family. They wonder what a family even is. There's a woman I quote in the book, a South African novelist, who said that for young people who feel that they have no future, fascism and communism appear as their only hope. We can't let it get to that place in this country. Not only can we not close our eyes to the rise of soft totalitarianism, but we also have to understand that a lot of these young people who are turning to socialism or even to communism, as we see in some places, as an answer to their problems, these young people do have real problems.
Yeah, that's right. And they have a short memory. And I think that's the other thing. My wife leads our Colson Fellows cohort here in Colorado Springs. And about a year ago, around the conversation was, why are young people so drawn to, some ideas that we've seen historically have failed? And two of the millennials that are in the group, really sharp students, brought up that point, which is, our historical memory doesn't go back to the Cold War. Our historical memory goes back to the financial collapse of 2008. We've never been taught this. The church never addresses, these sorts of issues. I think right now, Rod, we've seen in the chaos of 2020, so many instances, pastors and churches trying to be relevant to the justice issues of the day, kind of chasing around in a kind of a cultural whack-a-mole sort of approach to things. And they find themselves buying into ideas and philosophies out of the draw of the moment without that sort of historical context that father gave you in Moscow.
That's right. That's right. I talked to a 26-year-old Californian who happened to mention to me that she thought communism was a beautiful idea. I'm like, well, what about the gulags? She goes, well, what are gulags? John, this even happened to me in Russia. When I was interviewing
in Russia,
I was interviewing Ogorodnikov, that dissident, in a lobby of a hotel. And I went over to pay for the tea we had ordered, and the young waitress said, who is that? Because she could tell I had my laptop out and I was talking to him. She said, who is that man? I said, he's one of the greatest men in Russia. He survived the Gulag. And she said, the Gulag? I think I've heard of that in Russia. I found this over and over again also in Eastern Europe with the Generation Z and the younger millennials. They have no memory. Obviously, they weren't there for communism. But more importantly, they don't want to know about it, because the memory of what communism meant, what their parents and their grandparents went through, serves as a burden to them, because it tells them that this can happen here too, and you have a responsibility to that past. They don't want that responsibility because it gets in the way of the life they want to live, as completely free of any attachments to the past, of anything that defines them as people. In a similar way, John, I tell the story in the book about being in Hungary, in Budapest, riding on a tram through this city with my translator, who was maybe 29, 30 years old, young wife, young mom. She said that she had so much trouble talking to the few friends she had who are Christians like her. She had so much trouble talking to them about the things she's struggling with, like being a new wife and a new mom. She said, whenever I talk about it, about my struggles, they immediately say, oh, just leave your husband, put your kid in daycare, go back to the office, be yourself. And she said, I tell them, I'm happy being a wife. I'm happy with my son, but it's a struggle. And I just don't know why I'm not allowed to be unhappy in the moment. I said, it sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. She said, that's exactly it. Well, it turns out, John, that this is a line from Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, where the totalitarianism there is not like in Orwell when they try to maintain control by inflicting pain and terror on people, but rather it's when the state tries to maintain control by managing people's pleasures and their comforts. To be free in that Huxleyan totalitarian state, to be free was to be willing to be unhappy and to be able to be unhappy. So that's what we're fighting for. It sounds so unpleasant, but that is where real life is, not in a sort of perfect dollhouse world where everything must be perfect. And if it's not perfect, we freak out and we demand that the state or the teacher or the university come in and set everything for us so we never have to be anxious. That way is the way to bondage.
So let me just say something that should be an obvious thing to many of us, but maybe not. The sort of situation that you're describing is not something solvable by the next election. It's not something solvable. It's such a deeply cultural reality of kind of where we're at. And it is very different. And you do a very, I think, careful job of saying, look, we're not talking about gulags. We're not talking about sort of physical suffering, but it is something where there will be an enormous amount of social pressure to conform. And that's why I so appreciate and really took away, in addition to just this stirring inspiration from the number of stories that you tell of people we need to know about. And again, it's 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years old, so we don't know about them yet. But the See, Judge, Act, profound. Yeah. Part of that act is the title of the book, and I want to get to that because I'm a huge Solzhenitsyn fan. Live Not By Lies. As I was answering that teacher's question, what do I do? And she said, do I go and tell this to school? I'm not going to say this. I'm going to say this instead. Or do I just make my decision, not use pronouns at all, just call everyone by the name, and we'll see how long it lasts? And I think either one of those is a legitimate option, although I think they both end up the same place. Maybe just one takes longer than the other. But that's the point of Solzhenitsyn. Live not by lies. It doesn't mean you have to run out on every street corner and say everything that you think. But don't be forced to say something that's not true.
Right.
I think we underestimate the social pressure we will have on issues to say things that at the end of the day just aren't true.
Yeah, and it's tearing through the church right now too, on LGBT and on race. You know, people, there are legitimate conversations to be had on, all sides of this issue, but there's so many people who are terrified to say what they really think, to even offer the idea that I may be wrong about this, because they're afraid that they'll be targeted as a bigot, and be shamed. And just today, as you and I are talking, I got a letter from one of the readers of my book. He's a young Christian in Boston. He said that he went to an Ivy League school, and he knew that when he got out and started working, that it was going to be hard for him as a Christian to, he was going to be an alien, a stranger in a strange land. He said he had no idea how overwhelming the pressure to conform was going to be. He told a story about one of his colleagues, an evangelical from the American South, who, when COVID hit, they all had to go work from home, and she suddenly became super woke, and now she's on the verge of disfellowshipping herself from her own family because they're not woke. And he said it's like something has come over them.
Yeah.
And this is something we all have to be prepared for. The experiences of Solzhenitsyn, where he talked about the importance of standing up for the truth, no matter what it costs you, and the testimony of all these people in this book who stood up for the truth at great cost, in many cases, cost to their freedom and maybe even their lives at some point, are invaluable. Yuri Sipko, he's formerly the leader of all the Baptists in Russia. Now he's a retired pastor. I interviewed him for the book, and he said that's the first thing he asks people he meets, especially young people. Name 3 things you're willing to die for. And he said, if they can't say that they're going to die for Christ, your faith is hypocritical. Hard words, but this is a man whose father and all of the men in his Baptist community were sent to Siberia for their faith back under Stalin. I mean, these people know what it means. And in fact, I should say that Yuri says that even today, the younger Baptists are starting to go back and live like the underground church did, even in relative freedom in Russia, because they can see that all the freedom that has come to them and the prosperity is in fact taking them away from the gospel.
When you wrote a Benedict option, one of the things I said, is, although I'm a Kuyperian and I still advocate for the Benedict Kuyper option, despite what you say, the strength of your analysis there was the absolute fundamental need to thicken our Christian commitments through the thickening of local institutions. And you talk about the family in the book. You talk about the need to plan now in case you do get asked to say something that's not true. You can't decide that in the heat of the moment. And that's what I want to say, Rod, about Live Not By Lies. I hope the comparison to what we have seen in the past to where we're headed now is overblown. I hope it's not going to be this bad. I think you make a compelling case that it is headed that way. But I tell you, every single person can benefit from these stories and just this plan. I mean, I have parents talk to me all the time. How do I help develop my kids' faith? How do I make sure that they don't leave? If we're just talking about the pressure of university, see, judge, act. Don't say what's not true. And just living out that is enough of a game plan, I think, for parents and kids. So I have I was captivated. Read the book in less than 24 hours. It's your classic example of your good writing, and the stories are just compelling. The title, again, Live Not By Lies. Rod Dreher, blogger at The American Conservative. Also something you want to follow is his blog there at The American Conservative. And then you can also tell people where they can. I always tell people, if you're not on Twitter, don't start. But if you're on Twitter, you can follow me here. Where can people find you on Twitter?
At Rod Dreher, RODDREHER. And I want to say also that if any of your listeners want to get an autographed copy of the book, they can get it exclusively through the Christian bookstore 8 Day Books in Wichita, Kansas. You can order online.
Hey, I want to support any great little stores, and I've heard that 8 Day Books is just really one of those fantastic gifts to America that we need to get behind. It really is,
John. I mean, if you're ever through the Midwest, go there. It's like what you imagine that Tolkien and Lewis would want in a bookstore. It's there in Wichita, of all places, not in Oxford, in Wichita.
Wichita, yeah. They have an annual festival or something every year. They did in non-COVID years, right?
Yeah, they do. And it's just an amazing place. And one of these examples of thick Christian community that we can all learn from. And it's not just an Orthodox community. The owner of the bookstore is Orthodox. They're bringing in mere Christians from all traditions. And that too, John, and I know we can close on this, and we're getting to the end, but that's something I want to emphasize too in this book. I did interview Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox, because even though I am an Orthodox Christian, I have Orthodox commitments, and I don't want to diminish the importance of what separates us. At the same time, one thing I learned from all these people is that when they got to prison, these denominational differences fell away because they all realized the secret police came for them, not because they were Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox. The secret police came for them because they were followers of Jesus Christ. So we need to build these networks now while we can, because we're going to need each other in the future.
Again, the author, Rod Dreher, best-selling author of the book, The Benedict Option, the book title, Live Not By Lies. And again, find it at 8 Day Books if you'd like to get an autographed copy. Rod, good to see you, although from a long way away, and grateful for your work and contribution and for having this conversation today on the BreakPoint Podcast.
Thank you, brother.